So hello, good afternoon. Before I start and talk about this and then get into the lecture, I want to just respond again to a few questions respond publicly to a few questions that I got by email. I got several questions by email from freshmen who said, "This seems really hard, and should I be taking this as a freshman?" And the answer is that if you're a freshman at Berkeley, or if you're any kind of student at Berkeley, you're really smart, and you can get this course. If it's too abstract, in this last lecture was the most abstract lecture you get, you just need to ask me questions. We're getting more and more solid as we go along. Secondly, if there's an illusion you don't get, someone we had coffee with, and I won't name his name, though I remember it, asked me about this Swiss cartoon. You see a cartoon, you don't get the illusions in the cartoon, you should ask. Right? There's no excuse to leave the class confused or not clear on something. Okay? So my advice to freshmen and people who are just starting is stay with it. You can still drop after 2 weeks. Or 3 weeks, I think. You get a long time to drop in a semester. And see how it goes. But it's your job to ask questions. But it's also not high school anymore. So it is going to be slightly more abstract and slightly more demanding of you than maybe what you're used to in different kind of classes. Okay? And today's lecture is sort of probably the last one we're going to have, the next 2 lectures that are going to deal with issues of political theory and human rights. And it may go by fast because some of you maybe really know this stuff and some of you may have never heard of it. And so just slow me down if you have a question. Okay, please? And I know what it takes to get into Berkeley. So if you're here, you can get this. All right? That's the first point. That's the main point of my introduction. Now, I just wanted to show you this, I thought, kind of fascinating graph of your responses. And I'm not going to say very much more about it, except that you're going to, when I point this out to you, maybe you already see it yourself, there are lots of contradictions in this, in your views. And there'll be lots of contradictions that will emerge in the course. And a great deal of political effort goes into sorting out what our political stance should be toward some of these human rights. So here's an interesting one. Some of these, the right to a cultural life, that's in the UN Universal Declaration, and almost all of you thought this was a human right. But less than 40% of you thought that right to access the internet was a human right. Now, in Denmark and Norway, there have been explicit assertions that the right to access the internet is the sine qua non of a right to a cultural life. And I think most of you would in fact agree that if I cut off your internet access, full stop, no internet access, and you'd have a hard time participating in the life of the university, of almost anything that you participate in. So, there's a real issue here. Does the state owe everyone a right to access the internet? And that's a real policy issue. There are large parts of the United States where you don't have high-speed internet access. And it really does cut people off, I would argue, from cultural life. So I don't want to make a policy case to you guys, but I just wanted to point out to you that there are real issues here. Here's another interesting one. Illegal immigration. It speaks to the Hannah Arendt article. I asked you, did you think illegal immigrants had the same rights, human rights, as immigrants? And less than a majority of you did. It's sort of what Arendt argues, that it's the rights of citizens that matter, and that the state protects the rights of citizens, and the state doesn't have an obligation to protect the rights of people who aren't citizens. And they don't have a, quote, legal standing of citizens. Well, that's pretty interesting. Contradiction between the rights of citizen, in a document we're going to talk about next time, the French Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. The rights of man are clearly different, in your view, than the rights of citizen. So that's a pretty interesting one. And the lowest one we had, the right to bear arms, which is, of course, in our Constitution. Rights of sex offenders is an interesting one. I thought I'd get the lowest one on this. But right now, the Human Rights Watch in North Carolina is defending the rights of a registered sex offender to attend a Baptist church, of which he is a follower, despite the fact that the Baptist Church has a kindergarten, and he's legally prohibited from getting within 2,000 feet of any place where children gather. So, again, I want to argue the case with you, but I'm saying there is a conflict between this one set of rights and another set of rights. The one other one I thought was interesting, mothers and children are relatively high, up at 62%. Surprised that that's not more of you believe in this. But there's another very interesting case now, which the United States was a party to a legal action in the Inter-American Court of Justice. Do I have that right? Inter-American Court of Human Rights, which is a body of the Organization of American States, to which we belong, in which a woman in Colorado had a restraining order against her husband, former husband, to keep away from her and her children. And the authorities didn't support this. She was harassed by the husband, and the authorities didn't support, didn't help her. Her husband came, kidnapped the children. She desperately called the police. The police did all sorts of other things during that time. I mean, they were engaged in their regular activities. They helped some people find a cat. They did all sorts of things, but they weren't terribly busy. She's desperate. She's at the police station. Her husband appears at the police station with the truck, walks out with a gun, starts attacking the police. The husband is killed in a battle with the police, and the three children are dead in the backseat of the truck. She argued that the state of Colorado had violated her human rights as a woman who has a restraining order against the guy, and went up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court, the United States Supreme Court held that Colorado did not have the obligation to, it ought to, but didn't have a legal obligation to enforce this order. She then brought the case to this international court, a body to which the United States subscribes, and the international court held that yes, the United States does have this obligation. That is the obligation to defend women who are victims of physical assault. And it is said, I mean, I had followed the case after that. This is a very recent ruling just a few weeks ago. Supposedly, American jurisprudence may well comport itself with this international body. So there's a case in which things that we feel, barely the majority of us think these are rights, certainly international courts think are rights. So the interesting thing about this, just if you look at it, is that there are all sorts of queries and internal contradictions and political debates. And that's the sort of thing we're going to be engaged with. But what's interesting to me about this history is that there actually is a set of political institutions and legal institutions now in which we can debate this. So that's what's novel and new. The answer isn't novel and new. We don't have an answer. But the arena for dealing with it is new. And that's really a story I'm going to be telling you, the creation of these arenas. All right, so I'm going to this is what the lecture is actually about. This is the course again. This is what I'm going to lecture about today, but I just want to very briefly summarize what I said last time, because I know some of you weren't here, and some of you had questions about it. So let me just give you a brief repeat of what I said last time. So what I tried to suggest was that the philosophical and biological definition of what it is to be human haven't really changed very much in principle. And I also suggested that not very much followed just from being human, both theoretically and, in fact, empirically. What I tried to suggest that was new, and that's going to be the subject of this course, are new political claims and new ethical claims for humane treatment, claims that depend on all sorts of developments in law, in politics, in literature, in art, economics, and much more. So what counts as human and human rights is going to be a big part of this course. But it's always going to be discussed in the context of these very particular political, economic, artistic, and other developments. So I want to embed what I think is what we think of human in these contexts. So that's the one thing that's new, these different contexts. What else is new is these humanitarian movements, which anti-slavery is one, and there are many more which we'll talk about, and that these movements make a claim for universal empathy. That is, we ought to feel for lots of people outside our narrow circle. So the course is a course in the history of this universalism. It's a course in the history of law, and especially international law. It's a course in the history of the institutions in which all of these different views are embedded and which argue for these. It's also a course that I want to say contra Sam Moyn, whom you guys read, or hope read, contra Sam Moyn, which argues that it's a long history. So just to remind you what Sam Moyn said, he said, first of all, human rights, he says, are an anti-politics. They're supranational, that is, they're beyond the nation state, and the nation state is where politics goes on. So they're supranational, super-conventional political morality movement. So they're basically utopianism. They're basically utopian. They don't engage in politics where politics happens. That's his first point, and that's really his really big objection. His second point is that as a form of utopianism, human rights emerges only when other utopias had failed. So communism fails, socialism fails, the Western intellectual version of Marxism fails, and in place of what he took to be a kind of Marxist utopianism, you get a human rights utopianism. So it's apolitical, and it's a substitute ideology. All that together means that the emergence of human rights is quite specifically in the 1970s when those other ideologies failed. And everything that comes before it isn't really, in his view, human rights. So human rights is something new, and it's a product of the recent past, the product of one failed ideology, right? And this works as a utopian ideology because it is above politics. That's his real objection to human rights, that it claims to be up there and not really engaged. You got that. And the Sam Bass article argued against that view. Well, the course is really, in some sense, an argument against Sam Moyn, who is a former grad student here and is a friend and who edits a major human rights journal. He's a good guy, so I'm against him in the sense that I'm antagonistic to him, but against him in the sense that I want to argue in the course that there actually is both a deep intellectual history of human rights, but also a deep anthropology of human rights activism, that we're going to look at in a bunch of arenas. So when we look at criminal justice policy, which he's not interested in at all, we're going to look at a longer history of criminal justice policy. When we look at the arts engagement with human rights, we're going to look at a longer history of the arts engagement with politics. So what I want to suggest is that immigrant rights and sexual rights and these different modalities in which some of these things are argued, in fact, are and always have been immediately politically engaged, both in the domestic sphere and international sphere. So yes, Moyn is right that there is this spike, as you might recall from the last graph, in international human rights discourse. And in the international arena, Moyn, I think, is also right that the kind of recent 15 years of neoliberalism has spawned, in some sense, a utopian talk about rights. I don't think everything he says is off. But I think you can have that part of the story and the worry about being apolitical, which he worries about, or not sufficiently political and critical on the one hand, but you can also have the fact that this doesn't come out of nowhere, and that it in fact does have a longer and actually interesting and deeper history that we can trace back to the 18th century, into many 19th century movements, into earlier 20th century movements. And we'll do that in part because we broaden the horizon. We're going to look at, as I say, lots of arenas that he doesn't look at. He's